The Bible is no more an objective moral foundation or standard than is anyone's intuitions about morality. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and I'm increasingly seeing Christian apologists trying to argue that non-theists aren't allowed to make moral arguments because they have absolutely no objective standard or foundation for their morality, and you can't have a moral philosophy without an objective moral standard or foundation, and therefore only people who have the Bible have an objective moral standard or foundation. And that is just pure and utter nonsense. I'm not a moral philosopher by any stretch of the imagination, but I am an expert in the Bible, and I can see at least 3 reasons that the Bible cannot possibly constitute an objective moral foundation or standard. And the first has to do with the fact that there's no such thing as the Bible. There are Bibles, and they say different things. And so first we have to agree on what Bible we're talking about. We're talking about the Samaritan Pentateuch? We're talking about the Jewish Tanakh? We're talking about Codex Sinaiticus? Or maybe Vaticanus? Or maybe we're talking about the Textus Receptus? Or maybe it's NA 28? Maybe it's the Latin Vulgates? Or maybe it's the Douay Rheims? Or maybe we're talking about a Protestant version of the Bible? What manuscripts are we incorporating? Are we going to amend the Masoretic text with readings from the Septuagint? Are we going to consider the Dead Sea Scrolls? What if we're looking at a passage that is attested across multiple manuscripts within the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the readings are different from manuscript to manuscript? We have a bunch of judgment calls we have to make before we can even move on past figuring out what the Bible is. And at that point, our foundation is consensus, not objectivity. But that brings us to translation. The overwhelming majority of the apologists who are engaging in this argument are addressing the Bible in translation, not in the source languages. And translation is riddled with subjectivity. As objective as we think we can be about some things in translation, we cannot escape subjectivity in translation, which is why a lot of the morally freighted passages in the Bible can be translated and are translated in different and even contradictory ways. And this brings us to how we interpret the Bible once we do agree on an edition and a translation. This is why in the 19th century you had people who agreed on a translation of the Bible. Half of them said, "See, slavery is bad," and the other half said, "See, slavery is good." Same Bible, same translation, contradictory positions on what moral standard is supported by the Bible. And this is true of numerous different questions within one's moral philosophy. So attempts to argue that the Bible represents some kind of objective moral standard or foundation are subjectivity upon subjectivity upon subjectivity. And when people try to argue that the Bible represents an objective moral standard, that's just because they are part of a consensus view about morality shared by a given social identity. And this is where intuition comes in, because our moral intuitions are shaped by evolution as well as our material, our historical, and our social circumstances. So you will see an awful lot of consistency in the moral philosophy of people who share similar sets of social identities, and that's going to be very common within given religious traditions. So it's actually intuitions and identity politics that are steering the ship. But in an effort to try to advance their own interests and their standing and the standing of their social identities, they try to gin up this notion that they're the only ones who are allowed to be right, and that the people who are outside of those social identities are not even allowed to make moral arguments. It is an incredibly rickety and subjective argument that cannot exist where there is a capacity and a concern for critical thought, which is why the argument is pretty much only made by Christian apologists. And the fit for this video has been Gambit.